He's the one. He's the one. He's been watching you all night.
The lounge was too quiet for the number of millionaires breathing inside it. Golden light bled from the chandeliers, falling in perfect halos on crystal glasses, silk ties and the gleam of pens poised over contracts. Waiters glided between tables, invisible except when a hand lifted for champagne. But in the center of the room, at a polished oak table designed to stage wealth, sat Richard Halden, the man who had built an empire on formulas no one else could decode. Richard leaned back, his suit cutting black angles in the light. His signature was all that stood between him and $100 million merger, the kind of deal whispered about in elevators, the kind of deal that bought cities. Around him, board members and lawyers shifted with restless confidence, rehearsing the victory in their heads. But Monica saw something else. She'd been hired that evening to document the ambiance for Halden's PR team. Polished photos of clinking glasses, discreet smiles, history in the making. She was supposed to stay behind the lens, neutral, professional. Instead, her eye snagged on the waitress standing at Halden's shoulder, Elena Vega. She carried herself with the poise of someone who'd learned invisibility the hard way. Her uniform was the same as the others, pressed white shirt, black vest, but she moved like she was balancing more than a tray of drinks. Monica's camera followed her unconsciously, sensing a disruption that hadn't yet happened. Richard dipped his pen. The crowd leaned closer, and then Elena leaned closer too. "Sir," she said softly, her voice brushing against his ear, "that's the wrong formula." The words were almost lost under the sweep of a violin from the lounge band. Almost. Monica felt them more than she heard them, a tremor in the air like someone had knocked the needle off a record. Richard's hand froze mid-stroke. Ink bled onto the page, a black dot expanding. "What did you say?" His tone was smooth, but his jaw locked tight. The lawyers blinked, confused. One of them, an older man with a scar above his eyebrow, shifted uncomfortably, as if the word formula scratched at something he didn't want remembered. Elena straightened, tray balanced perfectly, her face unreadable. "I said," she smiled faintly, polite, the way service staff learned to smile in the face of condescension, "that I can refresh your drink before you sign, Mr. Halden." The boardroom exhaled. Laughter fluttered around the table, too sharp, too eager. "She's right, Richard," one of the executives joked. Better a full glass before sealing history, but Richard wasn't laughing. He studied Elena like she was a cipher only he could crack. His pen hovered above the contract, unmoving. Monica's camera clicked involuntarily. The frame caught Richard's narrowed eyes, Elena's faint smile, and between them the contract bleeding ink. She lowered the lens quickly, pulse rising. Something irreversible had just happened, and only a handful of people knew it. Richard spoke again, voice velvet over steel. "What did you mean, wrong formula?" The air tightened. The executives stopped their chuckling. Even the violinist hesitated. Elena dipped her head. "Nothing, sir. Just a slip of the tongue." She placed a crystal tumbler of bourbon beside him, her hand steady. "Please enjoy." She turned to leave, but Richard's hand shot out, catching her wrist. It was not the grip of a man drunk with power. It was sharper, suspicious, almost desperate. "Do you know something about this deal?" he demanded, low enough that only she and Monica, standing too close, could hear. Elena tilted her head. Her eyes, dark, unreadable, met his. "I know what I serve, Mr. Halden, and I know when something doesn't taste right." She pulled her wrist free gently, without force, and walked away. Not hurried, not frightened, just gone. The silence that followed stretched until it snapped. One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "Shall we proceed, Richard?" But Richard didn't sign. He tapped the pen against the table, gaze locked on the door Elena had vanished through. Later, in the smoking terrace, Monica overheard the fragments. Richard's lawyers circled him like loyal hounds. "She's no one, just a waitress." "Don't let paranoia ruin the deal." "Richard, the ink's dry on the numbers. There's nothing left to question." But Richard wasn't listening. He stared at the city skyline, a man whose fortune was built on precision, and who had just been reminded of imperfection. She said, "Formula," he muttered, almost to himself. "Not contract. Not terms. Formula." Monica's stomach flipped. She wasn't supposed to hear this, wasn't supposed to care, but she couldn't forget the way Elena had delivered that whisper. Not reckless, not nervous, calculated. Richard finally snapped at his team. Find out who she is. Now. Downstairs, Elena clocked out of her shift. She untied her apron, slipped it into the laundry bin, and stepped into the night air like she hadn't just fractured a billionaire's confidence. Her phone buzzed, a message she ignored. Instead, she lifted her face to the sky, breathing hard, as though she'd just surfaced from deep water. Inside, the celebration was unraveling. The $100 deal sat unsigned, contracts curling at the edges from spilled bourbon. Executives whispered furiously, suspicions scattering like marbles across the floor. And Monica, caught between worlds, reviewed the photos on her camera. The last one chilled her most. Elena's lips near Richard's ear, her whisper frozen in pixels. Monica zoomed in, almost against her will, tracing the invisible line of words that had just cost or saved someone a fortune. She saved the photo, separate from the rest in a private folder, because sometimes the story didn't begin with a signature, it began with a whisper. The smell of antiseptic clung to Elena's clothes long after she left the hospital. She hated that smell, the way it lingered, how it followed her into the grocery store, into the apartment, even into Mateo's hair when she kissed him goodnight. It was the scent of waiting rooms and whispered diagnoses, of doctors who avoided her eyes when they said complications. Tonight, she carried it home like a ghost. Mateo was asleep on the couch, his small chest rising unevenly beneath the blanket patterned with faded astronauts. The glow from the muted television painted his skin blue. Elena set her purse down quietly and crouched beside him, pressing her lips to his damp forehead. He stirred but didn't wake. She traced the IV scar along his arm with her eyes, then straightened and walked into the kitchen. The bills waited on the table like soldiers lined for battle. Red letters stamped past due, notices folded in half to hide the numbers. She flipped through them quickly as if speed might shrink the debt. Her phone buzzed. Dr. Lambert's office. Reminder, follow-up appointment Friday. She dropped it face down on the table. Mom, Mateo mumbled from the couch. She hurried back. I'm here, baby. His eyelids fluttered. Did you work late again? Just a little, but I'm home now. She smoothed his hair back, forcing a smile. And tomorrow we'll have pancakes. With chocolate chips, he grinned weakly. Promise? Promise. She stayed beside him until his breathing slowed, steady but fragile, as though each inhale was borrowed. Elena didn't cry anymore, not the way she had when Mateo was first diagnosed. Back then, she'd collapsed in bathrooms, fists pressed to her mouth, wondering how a child's body could betray him so young. She'd begged her husband, Daniel, to stay, to fight with her. He had lasted 3 months before the weight crushed him. I can't do this, Elena, he had said, bags already packed. I didn't sign up for a lifetime of hospitals. She had wanted to scream at him. Instead, she'd gone still. That was the day something inside her shifted, when grief hardened into resolve. Now, years later, Daniel sent the occasional child support payment. Never enough, never on time. Mateo never asked for him anymore. The next morning, Elena woke at 5, exhaustion like sand in her veins. She showered in silence, tied her hair back, and slipped into her waitress uniform. Mateo stirred but didn't wake when she kissed his cheek. At the diner, she poured coffee, scribbled orders, smiled until her cheeks ached. The regulars didn't see the weight she carried. They saw the efficient server who remembered how they liked their eggs. On her 15-minute break, she sat outside with a cigarette she didn't light. Her phone buzzed with a new notification. News of Richard Halden's pending $100 merger. His photo filled the screen. Immaculate suit, confident smile, headlines that praised him as a visionary. Elena studied the face. To the world, he was untouchable. But she knew better, because tucked in a drawer at home, hidden beneath Mateo's coloring books, were copies of medical reports, research papers, and corporate filings she'd spent months piecing together. She had traced every thread back to Halden's pharmaceutical empire. The very formula that had brought him wealth was the same one linked to Mateo's illness. He had built his empire on poison, and she was done being a silent casualty. That night, she returned to the hospital with Mateo for another round of tests. She sat by his bedside, listening to the beeps of the monitors, the shuffle of nurses. Mom? Mateo's voice was hoarse. Yes, love? Why do we come here so much? Her chest tightened. Because your body needs a little extra help. And these people, they give it, he frowned. But why me? She smoothed his blanket. I don't know. The truth lodged in her throat. Because a rich man made choices that broke children like you. She couldn't tell him. Not yet. But one day, he would understand why his mother had worked until her hands blistered, why she'd risked everything. Elena leaned back in the stiff chair, exhaustion pulling her under. Before sleep claimed her, she whispered into the sterile air, I won't let him win, Matteo. I swear it. The following week blurred. Double shifts, hospital visits, bills arriving faster than tips. But underneath the grind, a sharper rhythm pulsed. She began to study Richard Halden like prey. She learned his routines, the hotels he favored, the aides who shadowed him. She watched footage of his speeches, memorized the cadence of his voice, the way his arrogance disguised itself as charm. At night, when Matteo was asleep, she spread documents across the kitchen table. Black and white pages glared under the weak lamp. She highlighted drug trial results, notes of unexplained fatalities scrubbed from the final reports, payoffs tucked into innocuous accounting lines. Every number, every signature, was a nail for his coffin, but she knew evidence wasn't enough. Halden was too powerful, his lawyers too practiced at erasing truths. To bring him down, she would need something sharper, something personal, a whisper at the right moment. Elena stared at herself in the bathroom mirror one morning before a hotel shift. Her reflection looked older than 32. Shadows under her eyes, lines of fatigue etched too deep. Yet there was something else in her gaze, a quiet fire, the kind that smolders until it devours. She pressed her palms against the counter. You don't get to break me, she whispered as if Halden could hear. You don't get to take him. When she stepped into the uniform, she was no longer just a waitress. She was a mother with nothing left to lose, and a plan only she understood. By the time she arrived at the luxury hotel lounge that evening, her movements were practiced calm. She served glasses, smiled politely, kept her head down, but inside her pulse was steady, her purpose sharp. Richard Halden sat at the center table, pen poised over history. Elena moved closer, tray balanced. Her hands didn't shake. Wait, she told herself. Wait until the silence is deepest, until every eye is fixed on him. And then, when the moment split open like a vein, she would lean in, and she would whisper. The conference room smelled of ambition. Too much cologne, too much coffee, too many men in suits pressing their hunger into the air. Richard Halden sat at the head of the table. Younger than, sharper, hungrier. He wore ambition like armor. His jaw was clean-shaven, his hair slick, his cufflinks engraved with initials no one dared mispronounce. Across from him sat David Klein, his business partner, his friend, or at least the man who still believed Richard knew what friendship meant. David's fingers tapped the glass table nervously as he slid a folder across. This is it, Richard. Years of work, years of tests. The formula's stable now. It's going to change everything. Richard opened the folder. Inside, neat rows of typed reports and hand-scrawled notes mapped out the journey from idea to breakthrough. A new pharmaceutical compound, cheap to produce, fast to manufacture, capable of treating a spectrum of autoimmune conditions. A miracle drug. David leaned forward, eyes glowing. Do you know what this means? People with no options finally having hope. Kids, families, and investors. Richard finished smoothly, scanning the pages. David blinked as if the word had smudged the purity of his dream. Well, yes, investors, but more than that, it's about impact. Real impact, Richard smiled faintly. He admired David's idealism the way a butcher admires a cow's wide eyes. Useful, tender, naive. In the weeks that followed, the two men worked like prophets on the verge of revelation. Long nights in the lab, fast food containers piling up, Richard's sharp voice clashing with David's cautious optimism. But cracks formed quickly. During one trial, a test subject suffered violent seizures. Another developed organ failure. David documented everything meticulously, his handwriting tightening with worry. We can't move forward until we understand the side effects, David insisted. Richard skimmed the reports. Outliers, anomalies. If 95 out of 100 patients respond well, that's success. They're not numbers, Richard. They're people. Richard's smile didn't falter. And people are desperate. Desperate people sign waivers. We'll bury the anomalies in technical jargon. No one will look too closely. David slammed the folder shut. You can't gamble with lives like this. Richard leaned in, voice low and cutting. You think anyone cares about the fine print? They care about hope. And hope, David, is a product. You just haven't learned how to sell it. The betrayal didn't come all at once. It came in whispers and signatures forged in meetings David wasn't invited to. Richard courted investors behind his back, promising results that weren't yet real. He paid a lab technician to adjust data tables. He hired lawyers to draft airtight non-disclosure agreements. And then one night David found the revised files. His own research edited, fatalities erased, reports rewritten to show inconclusive instead of catastrophic. He stormed into Richard's office, eyes blazing. You falsified the data. Richard didn't even look up from his desk. I corrected it. Corrected? David's voice cracked. People died, and more will live because of what we're building. Don't be so sentimental. David slammed his fists onto the desk. I'll go to the board. I'll go to the FDA. That was the moment Richard finally looked at him. Not with anger. Not even with fear. Just cool calculation, as if he were solving an equation. No, you won't, David faltered. What's that supposed to mean? Richard slid a document across the desk. A resignation letter. You'll sign it. You'll walk away with a generous payout, and you'll stay silent. David's throat worked. And if I don't? Richard stood towering over him. Then I'll ruin you. Every patent, every credit, every ounce of recognition, you'll lose it all. I'll make sure your name is a cautionary tale while mine is engraved in history. Silence stretched between them. Finally, David whispered, You can't buy your way out of truth forever. Richard smiled. Truth is malleable, David, like formulas, like people. Weeks later, David was dead. The papers called it an accident, car crash on a rain-slick road. Richard attended the funeral, stood with sunglasses shading his eyes, placed a solemn hand on the widow's shoulder. He delivered a eulogy about brilliance, about vision, about carrying on his friend's dream. By the end of that year, the formula had a name, a patent, and a launch date. Investors hailed Richard Halden as a pioneer. Share prices soared, and the side effects? Buried. Forgotten. Years later, in a cramped apartment across the city, Elena Vega sat at her kitchen table, flipping through yellowed clippings she'd salvaged from library archives. One headline screamed, Halden Pharmaceuticals launches miracle treatment. Another, visionary CEO carries on partner's legacy. Elena's hands shook as she traced the timeline. The dates of the first drug trials, the release to the market, the flood of prescriptions, the same year Matteo was born, the same year his symptoms began. She reached for the next document, a coroner's report she'd begged a sympathetic nurse to leak. Fatalities marked as rare anomalies. Organ failure, seizures, the same symptoms Matteo endured every day. Her stomach twisted. It wasn't fate. It wasn't bad luck. It was him, Richard Halden. The empire he built was carved out of her son's suffering. She pressed her hands against her face, tears hot against her palms. For years she'd told herself the sickness was random, cruel biology. But no, there was a name, a face, a man who had chosen profit over children like Matteo. She opened her laptop, pulled up a photo of Halden from a recent gala. Smiling, glass of champagne in hand, headlines hailing him as a savior. Her reflection glared back from the screen, red-rimmed eyes and clenched jaw. You killed him, she whispered to the screen. Every day you let him suffer, you kill him again. Her breath steadied. The grief hardened into something colder. And I will kill your empire. Meanwhile, in his penthouse office overlooking the city, Richard Halden gazed at his reflection in the glass. His hair was grayer now, his features heavier, but the hunger burned just the same. The formula had made him untouchable. Richer than he'd ever dreamed. Entire hospitals carried his name. Universities begged for his funding. Politicians courted his donations. He poured a drink, savoring the burn. Behind him, portraits of his achievements lined the walls, magazine covers, awards, smiling photographs of him shaking hands with world leaders. Yet sometimes, in the quiet, he thought of David. The way his friend's voice had cracked with betrayal. The way he'd said, "You can't buy your way out of truth forever." Richard dismissed the memory, lifting the glass in a private toast. "To the perfect formula," he murmured. But downstairs, across the city, Elena's whisper was already forming, not yet spoken, not yet delivered, but waiting, sharp as glass, patient as a wound. The first time Richard Halden asked Elena Vega to sit instead of stand, it startled her. They were in the hotel lounge again, 2 weeks after the whisper that had stalled a $100 million deal. Elena had expected to be fired. Instead, she found herself requested by name for every private dinner Richard hosted in that gilded room. "Sit," he said now, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. His voice was low, calm, commanding. She hesitated, tray still balanced in her hands. "Sir, I'm on shift. I'll cover your wages for the hour," he interrupted. "Sit." The executives at the table laughed uneasily, as if unsure whether this was flirtation, intimidation, or both. Elena set the tray down and lowered herself into the chair, her face composed, her pulse racing. Richard leaned closer, the faint burn of whiskey on his breath. "You're sharper than the rest of them. You proved that." She tilted her head, careful. "By correcting your drink order?" His smile was thin, amused. "By saying what no one else would dare. That takes nerve." Over the next few weeks, the pattern repeated. Richard began pulling her aside after events, speaking to her in half-whispers no one else was allowed to hear. He asked questions about her son, about her life, about what it meant to survive without safety nets. Elena answered with curated honesty. "Yes, I'm a single mother. Yes, I work double shifts. No, I don't complain because no one cares." Her tone was stripped of flattery. She never begged, never asked for favors, and that was precisely what disarmed him. Richard was surrounded by sycophants. Board members laughed at jokes that weren't funny. Politicians thanked him for donations disguised as philanthropy. But Elena looked him in the eye and told him the truth. "That suit probably cost more than my rent for a year," she said one night, pouring his drink. "And yet you spill bourbon on it like it's nothing." Instead of anger, he laughed. A genuine, startling laugh. "You're dangerous," he told her. "Not dangerous," she replied coolly. "Just honest." In private, Richard began to test her. He invited her to small dinners, just the two of them, no board, no press. He spoke about his youth in clipped fragments, about long nights in labs, about betrayal without ever naming David Klein. "You think money solves everything?" she challenged once, swirling a glass of wine he'd poured for her. "Not everything," he admitted, "but almost. And the rest?" "The rest is solved by control." Elena studied him carefully, filing the words away like evidence. Every conversation was a breadcrumb leading back to the man who had destroyed Mateo's life. But she let her expression soften. "Control doesn't sound very human." He smiled again, slower this time. "That's why it works." The line between mentor and confidant blurred. Sometimes he spoke to her like a daughter, dispensing advice in measured tones. "Never show your weaknesses. People smell them like blood." Other times his gaze lingered too long, his voice dropping an octave as he asked, "Do you ever wonder what it's like to step out of your life and into someone else's?" Elena held his stare without blinking. "Every day," the tension hung charged before she stood and collected their glasses. "But then my son needs breakfast and reality comes back." She left him with that, an answer that was both deflection and bait. At home, Elena spread documents across her kitchen table after Mateo went to bed. She replayed Richard's words in her head, aligning them with the buried reports she'd collected. Every slip, every boast, every careless phrase he uttered in her presence became ammunition. She kept notes in coded shorthand. Control, cover-up. Almost everything, money trails. Eyes linger, use it, but as she scribbled, she caught her reflection in the window, a woman leaning into the trust of a man she loathed. Laughing at his jokes, accepting his wine, the disgust burned in her throat. Yet when Mateo coughed in his sleep, the sound ragged and sharp, Elena's resolve sharpened again. This isn't about me. This is survival, his survival. One night after a charity gala where Richard had paraded in front of cameras as a benefactor, he insisted on walking her to her car. "You shouldn't have to go home alone," he said. "I always do," she replied. The garage was quiet, echoing with their footsteps. Richard stopped beside her rusted sedan, staring at the chipped paint as if he'd never seen poverty up close. "You deserve better," he said softly. Elena met his eyes. For a second, the silence between them was thick, dangerous. The weight of what he meant or wanted hung suspended. She forced a faint smile. "Better costs money. And money always comes with strings." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't know me as well as you think." Her voice was steady. "Oh, I think I do." She unlocked her car and slid inside before he could answer. In his penthouse that night, Richard poured himself another drink. He stared at the city skyline but saw only her eyes, sharp and unflinching. He told himself he kept her close because she was honest, refreshing. But beneath that justification was something else. A flicker of desire, a curiosity about a woman who didn't bend. For a man who controlled everything, the unpredictability was intoxicating. In her apartment across town, Elena kissed Mateo's forehead and tucked him in tighter. She whispered, "Almost there, baby. Almost." Then she opened her notebook and wrote in bold letters. Step 1. Make him trust. Step 2. Make him talk. Step 3. Make him fall. She closed the notebook and sat in the dark, her face unreadable, because seduction wasn't about romance. It was about disarming a man until he couldn't see the knife in your hand. The first article was barely a paragraph, tucked between political scandal and sports results. Unnamed sources suggest irregularities in Halden Pharmaceuticals' early drug trials. Fatalities mislabeled. Data altered, no names. No hard evidence. Just smoke curling into the air, but Richard Halden noticed. He always noticed. At breakfast, he slapped the paper onto the marble counter. His lawyer, sipping espresso, skimmed it and shrugged. "It's nothing. A blogger trying to get clicks. We'll send a cease and desist." Richard didn't look at him. His gaze was fixed on the byline. Mark Renshaw, investigative journalist. Persistent, the kind who never let smoke dissipate without finding fire. Richard's fingers drummed the counter. Someone fed him this. And when he thought of whispers, when he thought of eyes that didn't bend, he thought of her. That night, Elena wiped down tables at the hotel, her movements calm, controlled, but her heart hammered every time her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. Renshaw had run the first sliver of her evidence, fragments of trial reports she'd stolen from Richard's private files. Carefully redacted, enough to provoke curiosity but not enough to reveal her source. She hadn't expected it to land so quickly. Or so loudly. Elena, her body stiffened. She turned to find Richard standing in the doorway of the lounge, hands in his pockets, smile carved too precisely. "You're late," she said lightly, masking the tremor in her voice. He walked closer, his shadow long across the polished floor. "Am I, or are you early?" The words slid off him like silk, but his eyes were knives. She forced herself to meet them. "Can I get you a drink?" "Not tonight." He leaned in slightly. "Tonight I want honesty." Her throat tightened. "About what?" His smile deepened, empty of warmth. "About who you've been talking to." Elena held her breath. A dangerous game, but one she had chosen. She shrugged. "I talk to customers, to staff, to my son's doctor. Do you want a list?" Richard studied her for a long moment, then straightened. "Be careful, Elena. Some conversations cost more than you can pay." He walked away, leaving her trembling. 2 days later, she came home to find her bank account frozen. The hospital billing office called that afternoon. "We're sorry, Ms. Vega, but without proof of coverage or payment, we can't authorize Mateo's next treatment." Her hands went numb around the phone.
"What? No, you've always billed me monthly."
I'm good for it. I understand," the clerk said, voice flat with bureaucracy. "But your account has been flagged. It says your employment was terminated." Her chest hollowed. "Terminated. I just worked a shift yesterday." But by evening, her schedule at the hotel had been wiped, her ID card deactivated. No explanation, just absence. She called the manager in a panic. "There must be a mistake," he sighed, voice thick with discomfort. "Elena, I'm sorry. Orders from above, Mr. Halden doesn't want you here anymore." Her stomach dropped. "And that's it?" "Just like that. I can't do anything. He owns the place." The line went dead. Elena sat on the edge of her bed that night, the room dark except for the weak glow of Mateo's nightlight. He was asleep, his breathing shallow, a faint rattle in his chest. The bills were spread across the floor like a battlefield she could no longer win. Rent, utilities, hospital charges. She pressed her fists into her eyes until she saw stars. Richard hadn't confronted her with anger. He had done worse. He had erased her stability piece by piece with surgical precision. Blood money, she thought bitterly. Every dollar in his empire soaked in the pain of people like Mateo. And now he was bleeding her dry. For a moment, she felt herself collapsing, falling into that familiar pit of despair. She imagined calling Renshaw, telling him it was over, that she couldn't risk Mateo's life. But then she heard a cough. Mateo's cough, weak, cracked. She looked at him, at the child who had endured needles and fevers and nights where he clutched her hand until dawn, and something inside her hardened. The next morning, Elena dialed Renshaw. He answered on the first ring. "You weren't exaggerating," he said, voice low. "The documents you leaked, they've rattled cages. But I need more, names, proof." Elena closed her eyes. Fear surged like ice through her veins. But her voice was steady when she said, "You'll get more. Everything he's hidden, I'll find it. Are you sure? He'll come after you harder. He already has." She glanced at Mateo's sleeping figure in the other room. "And he took the only thing I can't afford to lose. So now I'll take everything from him." That evening, Richard sat in his penthouse office staring at the city. His assistant hovered by the door. "The journalist hasn't backed off," she reported. "He's digging deeper. We can try to silence him." "No." Richard swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Let him dig. He won't find anything I haven't buried." But as he said it, a flicker of unease slid through him, because for the first time in years he couldn't predict the move of the woman he'd underestimated. In her apartment across town, Elena packed a bag with gloves, a burner phone, a flash drive. She kissed Mateo's forehead and whispered, "Sleep tight, baby. Mama has work to do." Then she stepped into the night, no longer just a waitress or a struggling mother. She was a woman who had nothing left to lose. And a man with everything to lose had just made her his enemy. Elena had always trusted her sister more than anyone. Marisol was the one who stayed after Daniel left. The one who picked up Mateo from school when Elena's shifts ran long. The one who held her when she broke down in sterile hospital bathrooms. They had been each other's lifelines through a world that seemed determined to drown them. So when Marisol knocked softly on her apartment door late one night, Elena felt only relief. "Come in," she said, pulling her inside. "I need to show you something." Papers littered the kitchen table. Printouts of trial reports, scribbled notes, fragments of Richard Halden's empire peeled back like rotten wallpaper. Elena spread them out, voice urgent, almost feverish. "This is it, Mari, proof." The formula was flawed from the start. He knew. He buried the side effects, paid off officials, rewrote the trials. And now, her hand shook as she tapped a report. "Now we have people dying, kids like Mateo suffering, and he's sitting on billions." Marisol's face softened. She placed a hand over Elena's. "You're killing yourself with this. I'm saving Mateo." Elena's voice cracked. "Don't you see? If I bring him down, maybe I can save others too." "Maybe," Marisol squeezed her hand. "I believe you." Elena's throat tightened. The words mattered. Belief mattered. "I knew you would. But belief has a price." The next morning, Marisol sat in a cafe across town, stirring her coffee until it went cold. A man in a tailored suit slid into the seat across from her. He carried no briefcase, no laptop, just a thin envelope. "You're sure?" the man asked. Marisol's eyes darted around the cafe. She nodded. "She's collecting everything. Documents, reports, even names. She's planning to leak it." The man pushed the envelope toward her. Inside cash. Enough to cover debts she'd been hiding from Elena for months. Marisol's hand trembled as she closed the flap. "She'll never forgive me." The man's expression didn't change. "She'll never know." She did know. 2 days later, Elena noticed changes. Richard no longer looked rattled. He looked prepared. When she arrived for a shift at the hotel, security followed her movements. The manager, usually neutral, avoided her eyes. And then Renshaw, the journalist, called her, voice urgent. "Elena, someone tipped Halden off. He knows about you. He has details no one but your family could have told him." The room tilted. What details?" "Your hospital bills. The nights you sat in on trial records. Even the names you mentioned to me in confidence. He used them to discredit the leaks." Elena gripped the counter, bile rising in her throat. Only one person had known all of that. Marisol. That evening, Elena stormed into her sister's apartment. Mateo trailed behind, confused, clutching his blanket. Why? Elena demanded the moment Marisol opened the door. Why would you do this? Marisol froze. Elena, you sold me out. Her voice cracked like glass. To him. To the man who's killing my son. Marisol's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean. You didn't mean? Elena laughed bitterly. What did you mean then? That the money was worth it? That Mateo's life is worth less than your bills? Marisol's lip trembled. I was drowning. The rent, the loans, I was drowning too, Elena shouted. And I still am. But I never once thought of betraying you. You were all I had left. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. Mateo tugged at Elena's sleeve, whispering, Mama? But she couldn't look at him. She turned back to Marisol, her face cold. You're no better than him. Marisol flinched as if struck. Elena grabbed Mateo's hand and walked out without another word. Richard wasted no time. 2 days later, a story broke. Sources close to Elena Vega describe her as unstable, manipulative, and desperate for attention. Claims of falsified documents surface. Marisol's voice, disguised but unmistakable, echoed in the audio clip leaked to the press. She's obsessed. She's not thinking straight. She'd do anything to get money. Elena watched the broadcast from her couch, Mateo asleep in her lap. Rage and grief warred in her chest until she felt hollow. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was weaponized. Richard had turned her sister into a dagger aimed at her back. That night, Elena sat alone at the kitchen table. The documents were still there, scattered like a map of her failures. For a long time, she stared at them, tears streaking silently down her cheeks. Daniel had abandoned her years ago. Now Marisol had too. The people she loved always left, or worse, they sold her out. She thought of David Klein, Richard's partner, the man erased from history. She thought of the victims' names hidden in trial reports. Families who never even knew why their children died. Her grief curdled into something darker. Fine. If Richard thought betrayal would break her, he was wrong. Elena wiped her tears, sat straighter, and pulled a notebook toward her. She began to write, not just names and dates, but strategies. Places he would least expect her to strike. Weaknesses no amount of money could erase. The soft part of her. The trusting part was gone now. All that remained was vengeance. Meanwhile, Richard stood on the balcony of his penthouse, glass of bourbon in hand. The city lights glittering beneath him. His assistant approached. It worked. The sister's testimony painted her as unstable. Public opinion shifting, Richard smirked. Good, let her scream into the wind. No one listens to mad women. But as he raised his glass, he couldn't shake the image of Elena's eyes the night she whispered to him. Sharp, calculating, unbroken. A whisper can start a storm, he thought. Best to silence it before it grows. Back in her apartment, Elena whispered too, this time to Mateo as he stirred fitfully in his sleep. Rest, baby, she said, brushing his damp hair from his forehead. Mama's not done yet. She kissed his cheek, eyes burning. They took everything from me. Now I'll take everything from them. Her voice was steady, colder than she'd ever heard it, and for the first time, she believed it. The first time Elena saw Richard's private lab, it was from a distance. A sterile fortress tucked inside one of Halden Pharmaceuticals' downtown complexes. Card readers at every door. Cameras at every angle. It looked impenetrable. But desperation makes cracks visible. She had studied his routines for weeks. Times when Richard visited, when shipments arrived, when staff rotated. The night she chose the building was quiet. A skeleton crew inside. Elena wore a janitor's uniform stolen from a laundry service, her hair tucked under a cap. Her heart pounded as she swiped a cloned badge at the service entrance. The light turned green. In. She pushed her cart down the empty corridor, forcing herself to breathe evenly. Every squeak of the wheels felt like a siren. The lab smelled faintly of antiseptic and ozone. Behind thick glass, she saw rows of vials, machines humming, notebooks stacked neatly. And then, a door, marked archives. She slipped inside. The room was colder, the hum of refrigeration units filling the silence. She pulled on gloves, hands trembling, and began opening drawers, file after file, ledgers bound in leather. hidden behind false backs and unlabeled boxes. Her breath caught. Inside were handwritten notes, payments to officials, altered trial results, names of patients whose deaths had been erased from public record. Years of cover-ups cataloged in meticulous detail. She snapped photos with her burner phone, one after another, the click of the shutter sounding deafening in the sterile quiet. One page stopped her cold. A list of pediatric trial subjects. Children. Some names marked with red X's. Her knees buckled. Matteo could have been one of them. Was one of them in a way. His illness traced back here to this greed disguised as science. She forced herself upright. No time for grief. Proof was survival. Proof was power, as she slid the last ledger back. A sound froze her. Footsteps. She shoved the phone into her pocket, heart hammering, and pushed her cart into the hallway just as a guard rounded the corner. "Hey," he said, squinting. "I don't know you." "You knew?" Elena forced a tired laugh. "They keep hiring temps, right? Cheaper than overtime." The guard grunted. "Ain't that the truth?" He walked on, yawning. Elena exhaled only when the echo of his boots disappeared. She wheeled the cart out of the building, every nerve on fire, not breathing freely until she reached her rusted car and slammed the door. She pressed her forehead to the steering wheel, tears spilling hot and fast. She had it. Finally, she had it. Proof. But victory never comes clean. The next morning, she was served with papers. Richard's lawyers were petitioning the court to evaluate her parental fitness. The words blurred as she read them. Neglect, obsession, emotional instability. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. He wasn't just attacking her. He was threatening to take Matteo. She sat in the courthouse clutching Matteo's hand while a judge in black robes glanced at her with thinly veiled skepticism. Across the aisle, Richard sat with his team of attorneys. Immaculate in his tailored suit, every gesture polished. "Miss Vega," the judge said, "concerns have been raised about your capacity to provide a stable environment for your child. Your employment history is erratic. Your financial records show significant debt, and there are allegations that you've been engaging in dangerous activities." Elena's voice trembled but did not break. "Your Honor, I work double shifts to keep my son alive. I've sold my sleep, my health, everything I have just to buy him more time. If that makes me unfit, then what parent in this city is fit?" Richard's lawyer rose smoothly. "With respect, Your Honor, Ms. Vega is delusional. She believes she's at war with my client. She's invented conspiracies about formulas and bribes. That is not the behavior of a stable mother." Elena's chest burned with fury. She wanted to scream, to point at the ledgers, to expose him right there. But her attorney gripped her arm and whispered, "Not yet." The judge leaned forward. "The child's welfare is paramount. A temporary evaluation will be conducted." Elena's heart cracked. Temporary custody could mean weeks away from Matteo, weeks he might not have. That night, Matteo clung to her. "They can't take me, Mama," he whispered, voice hoarse. She held him tightly, burying her face in his hair. "No, baby. No one's taking you. Not while I'm breathing." But in the dark, when he finally fell asleep, her tears soaked the pillow. Richard had found her weakness, and he was squeezing it. She met Renshaw in a parking garage, passing him the phone loaded with photographs. "This is everything," she said. "Ledgers, bribes, pediatric deaths. He can't bury this." Renshaw flipped through the images, his jaw tightening. "This is dynamite. But you need to be careful. If he knows you took these, he already knows." Her voice was flat. "He's trying to take my son." Renshaw paused, studying her. "Then why keep going? Walk away. Protect him." Elena's eyes burned as she shook her head. "Protect him? The only way to protect Matteo is to end this. If Richard Halden walks free, he'll keep killing kids like him. He'll keep getting richer off their graves. I won't let that happen." Her voice cracked but steadied again. "I'd rather lose everything than let Matteo grow up in a world where men like Halden always win." In his penthouse, Richard poured another drink, staring at the city. His lawyer briefed him on Elena's move. She got into the lab, took photographs. "We don't know how." Richard's hand tightened on the glass. "Destroy her credibility. Make her look insane. If she tries to release them, no one will believe her." The lawyer nodded. "Already in motion." Richard exhaled slowly, but in the silence afterward, a flicker of unease gnawed at him. He had underestimated her once before. He wouldn't do it again. Elena sat by Mateo's bedside, watching his chest rise and fall. She stroked his hair, whispering softly. "You're my proof," she murmured. "My reason. They can take my job, my name, even my sister, but not you. Never you." Her tears slipped silently, but her voice hardened with each word. "This fight isn't just for us. It's for every mother who sat where I sat, praying their child would make it. For every family Richard buried under silence and money." She kissed his forehead. "Tomorrow we burn his empire." The courthouse steps swarmed with cameras. Flashes cracked the morning light as though lightning had descended on the city. Headlines screamed across every screen. Halden versus Vega, the trial of the century. Richard Halden emerged first, his suit a shade too perfect, his lawyers forming a protective wall around him. He didn't flinch at the cameras. He walked like a man who owned the pavement beneath his feet. Minutes later, Elena stepped into the chaos, clutching a worn leather folder. Inside, Mateo's medical records, his x-rays, his hospital charts, his life distilled into paper. She kept her chin high, though her knees trembled. "Mama, they're staring," Mateo whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "Let them," she murmured. "We're telling the truth." The courtroom buzzed like a hive. Journalists filled the benches. Spectators craned their necks for a glimpse of the billionaire and the waitress who dared defy him. Richard sat tall at the defense table, flanked by a team of attorneys in matching charcoal suits. Elena sat alone at the plaintiff's table, the leather folder resting in front of her like a shield. The judge entered, gavel striking. Court is now in session. The prosecution opened with a carefully measured statement outlining negligence, concealment, lives lost. But as they spoke, Richard's lawyers objected, interrupted, reframed. The rhythm faltered. By midday, it seemed the tide was turning in Richard's favor. His attorneys painted him as a visionary, a man who saved millions with breakthrough treatments. Any casualties, they argued, were tragic but inevitable, statistical outliers. And Elena? She was portrayed as unstable, driven by grief and financial desperation. Richard leaned back, smirking, as if the verdict was already written. Then the judge called her name, Ms. Vega. "Please take the stand." Elena rose slowly. Her hands shook, but her voice did not. She swore the oath, sat and looked out over the sea of strangers. Then at Richard, he met her eyes with the faintest curl of his lip, as if daring her to break. The prosecutor began gently. "Ms. Vega, can you tell the court why you're here today?" Elena nodded, clutching the folder. "Because my son is sick." Her voice cracked, raw. "Because he was given a drug, Your Honor. A drug made by Halden Pharmaceutical. They called it a miracle. They called it safe. But it was poison." She opened the folder with trembling hands, holding up a medical chart. "This is Mateo's file. 6 years old when he was first prescribed Haldenex. Within weeks, he had seizures. Within months, his liver was failing. The doctors said it was rare, impossible, just bad luck." She turned, pointing directly at Richard. But it wasn't luck. He knew. He buried the trials. He paid to silence the deaths. "And my son, my little boy, became collateral damage." Gasps rippled through the room. Richard's lawyers shot to their feet. "Objection. Emotional manipulation." The judge banged the gavel. "Overruled. Continue." Elena steadied herself, eyes blazing. "I worked his galas. I poured his drinks. I heard him brag about control, about how money solves everything. And I whispered one thing to him." She paused, voice lowering, the silence sharpening around her. "That's the wrong formula." Her words hung in the air, heavy, electric. Gasps rippled through the gallery again. The phrase, cryptic damning, sounded less like a metaphor now and more like a prophecy. The prosecutor stepped closer. "Ms. Vega, what did you mean by that?" Elena locked eyes with the jury. "That everything Richard Halden built is rotten. That his empire was founded on betrayal. Of his partner, of science, of the families who trusted him. And that one wrong formula, one decision to profit instead of protect, destroyed lives, including my son's." The cross-examination came like a storm. Richard's lead attorney rose, sleek and venomous. "Ms. Vega," he said, his tone dripping with pity. "We all sympathize with your son's condition. But isn't it true you've been struggling financially for years? That you have debts? That you were terminated from employment due to instability?" Elena's pulse raced, but she forced herself calm. "Yes, I struggle. Like millions of mothers. But unlike Richard Halden, I don't bury children to make my rent." The lawyer's jaw tightened. And isn't it also true that your own sister described you as obsessive? That you've been accused of fabricating documents to smear Mr. Halden's reputation? The betrayal still burned fresh, but Elena did not falter. She leaned forward, voice steady. My sister was paid. Bought with hush money. Just like every official Richard silenced. But the truth doesn't vanish because you throw cash at it. She raised her voice, letting it crack. The proof is in those ledgers. The bodies are in those trials. Ask the parents who buried their children if I fabricated their grief. The gallery stirred, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Finally, Richard himself was called. He strode to the stand, confident, controlled. He swore the oath, then leaned back casually like the court was his stage. Mr. Halden, the prosecutor began, do you deny altering trial records? Richard smiled faintly. Of course. My company has saved millions. No drug is perfect. We manage risks. That's science. And the ledgers Ms. Vega presented, taken out of context, standard industry practices, and the payments to silence families, his smile widened. Compensation, not silence. Again, standard practice. He glanced toward the jury, charm radiating. This woman is grieving. I understand her pain, but she has been manipulated by journalists, by desperation. I would never harm children. I built my life saving them. For a moment, his performance held. Some jurors nodded. The gallery quieted, until Elena rose, trembling but unshaken. Your Honor, she said, voice cracking through the silence. Please, let me say one last thing. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Elena turned to Richard, her eyes burning. You think you own this courtroom. You think you can buy the truth. But money can't erase the scars on my son's body. Money can't silence the cough that keeps him up every night. And money sure as hell won't save you when the world finally sees what you are. Her voice dropped to a whisper, raw and lethal. That's the wrong formula. This time, the jury leaned forward, the phrase echoing with layered meaning. Betrayal. Corruption. Prophecy. Richard's smile faltered, just for a second. And that second was all Elena needed. By the time court adjourned, the world outside was on fire. Reporters screamed questions. Hashtags trended globally, and Richard's once untouchable image began to crack. Elena walked down the courthouse steps, Mateo's hand in hers. She felt hollow, exhausted, but unbroken. The trial wasn't over. The war wasn't won. But for the first time, Richard Halden bled in public, and she had drawn the first cut. The first cracks didn't come from Elena's testimony. They came from the silence that followed. Silence that spread like a contagion. Across the newsroom, across the industry, across Richard Halden's empire. Silence that whispered, if she could speak, maybe I can too. Within a week, the cracks split open. A former lab technician went on record, voice shaking as she described being ordered to shred safety reports. Then a clinical researcher confessed to forging signatures on patient consent forms. Finally, an executive, one of Richard's own inner circle, produced a recording of boardroom meetings where Richard dismissed fatalities as statistical noise. Each revelation detonated like a bomb: financial fraud, medical malpractice, bribery traced through shell companies across continents. The empire Richard Halden had built, polished, untouchable, began to rot in public view. Elena watched the coverage from her living room couch, Mateo curled against her side. The TV flickered with footage of shareholders suing, politicians disavowing, the company's stock plunging. It should have felt like triumph, but Mateo's breathing was ragged, his cough deep and wet. Each sound cut sharper than any headline. She muted the TV and stroked his hair. Almost there, baby. Mama's almost finished. He looked at her with tired eyes. Did we win? Her throat tightened. Not yet, but he's falling. At Richard's penthouse, the collapse was chaos. Phones rang without pause. Lawyers shouted into headsets. Assistants scurried with folders like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Richard stood at the center of it all, still immaculate in his suit, refusing to let the storm rattle him. Freeze accounts if you must, he ordered. Delay filings. Threaten countersuits. We control the narrative. But as he spoke, another alert flashed on the news ticker. FDA launches criminal probe into Halden Pharmaceuticals. For the first time, Richard's hand trembled as he set down his glass. Elena's victory carried no parades, no applause. It carried the weight of survival. Every interview, every article dredged up the worst nights of her life. Mateo's seizures, the nights Daniel left, the betrayal of her sister. She replayed those traumas for strangers over and over, until the words hollowed her out. Sometimes she'd catch her reflection after a broadcast, her face gaunt, her eyes rimmed red, and think, I don't look like a hero, I look like a ghost. But when mothers began writing to her, letters, emails, whispered thanks outside the courthouse, she realized she was more than a ghost. She was their echo. Their grief had found a voice in hers. Marisol's silence hurt most of all. She hadn't called, not when Elena took the stand, not when Richard's empire burned, not even when Mateo was hospitalized again for another emergency procedure. Elena sat in the sterile waiting room one night, head in her hands, whispering to herself. She chose him. She chose money over blood. The betrayal still stung like it had happened yesterday, and yet sometimes, in her darkest hours, she longed for her sister's arms around her again, the comfort they once shared. That longing made her angrier than anything else. The trial dragged on. Richard's attorneys clawed at every witness, every shred of evidence. But the more they fought, the more whistleblowers surfaced. What had begun as Elena's solitary battle became a chorus of voices. The press called it the Halden effect. Courage, spreading like fire. But courage came at a cost. Mateo's health faltered. His treatments grew more invasive, his recovery slower. Elena missed school pickups, birthdays, moments that slipped away while she sat in courtrooms tearing her soul open. One night, after tucking him into bed, he whispered, "Mama, don't cry. You'll break." And she realized with a pang that her son, the one she was fighting for, had learned to comfort. Her Richard's collapse became spectacle. Footage of him being subpoenaed, looped on every channel. Protesters gathered outside his headquarters with signs that read, "Children are not collateral." In one clip, he shoved past reporters, his mask cracking. "This is a witch hunt," he barked, sweat gleaming on his forehead. Elena watched it from her hospital chair, Mateo asleep beside her. For the first time, she saw not a titan but a man cornered, and still it felt hollow. Justice didn't refill Mateo's lungs. Justice didn't heal her wounds or mend her family. Justice was a heavy stone she carried even as Richard's world burned. In court the next week, Richard was confronted with the whistleblower recordings. His attorneys objected, stalled, but the judge allowed them in. The room fell silent as his voice filled the speakers. People die. It's inevitable. The numbers balance out. We can bury the rest, gasps rippled through the gallery. Richard's face remained still, but his empire had finally spoken against him in his own words. Elena closed her eyes, Mateo's face vivid in her mind. She whispered to herself, not buried, not anymore. But outside the courthouse, the world wasn't simple. Her landlord raised the rent after cameras appeared on the block. She couldn't go to the grocery store without strangers approaching her. Half offered sympathy, half questioned her motives. At night, exhaustion pressed on her chest like a weight. She dreamed of Daniel walking away, of Marisol counting money, of Mateo's heartbeat on a monitor. Justice was a battlefield, but victory was a wound that never closed. One evening, she stood at the window of her apartment, staring out at the city lights. Mateo slept in the bedroom, machines humming beside him. The silence was unbearable. She thought of Richard, isolated now, abandoned by his allies, every secret clawed into daylight. She had wanted to see him destroyed. She had wanted revenge, and yet, as she stood there, she realized revenge wasn't a flame that burned clean. It was smoke choking, endless. She whispered to the glass as though speaking to herself. What does winning even mean? The city didn't answer. The next morning, her phone buzzed with another message from Renshaw. Another exec just flipped. They're turning over sealed settlement records. Halden's finished. Elena typed back only 3 words. He's already finished, because the truth wasn't about Richard anymore. It was about Mateo, about survival, about mothers who would never again have to bury their children in silence. And for the first time, the bitterness in her chest lightened, just slightly. Richard Halden sat alone in his penthouse, the empire around him in ashes. His glass was empty, his phone was silent. He stared at the city that had once bent to his will, and for the first time in his life he felt small. Elena closed her notebook that night, the one filled with codes and notes and plans. She tucked it into a drawer. The fight wasn't over, but the collapse had begun. She kissed Mateo's forehead, whispering into the dark, "We made them listen, baby. They can't unhear us now." Her voice was soft, but steady, and though justice weighed heavy, it was hers. The gavel struck once, sharp as a gunshot. "All rise," the bailiff commanded. The courtroom swelled with the sound of bodies shifting, whispers colliding. Elena stood, Mateo's small hand wrapped around hers, his IV port taped gently against his skin. He was pale but awake, his dark eyes wide with the weight of something he didn't fully understand. The judge cleared his throat. "In the matter of the People versus Richard Halden, this court finds the defendant guilty on all counts." The words rippled through the chamber, a tidal wave breaking against marble walls. Cameras flashed. Pens scratched furiously. Richard Halden sat motionless. For the first time in public memory, his jaw slackened, his composure fractured. His lawyers flanked him, whispering urgently, but he didn't respond. He stared straight ahead as though the world had vanished. The judge's voice carried on, steady, final. "The defendant is hereby sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. All personal and corporate assets shall be seized in restitution to the victims and their families." The gavel came down again. A dynasty ended with a thud. Outside, the crowd erupted, reporters shouting questions, victims' families sobbing, activists chanting Elena's name. She didn't linger. She didn't want the spotlight, the noise, the frenzy. She wanted only the small hand still clinging to hers. They slipped out a side exit, past the cameras and microphones, into the thin winter sunlight. The air tasted different. Not freer, not sweeter, just different. Elena pulled her coat tighter around Mateo and walked. The days that followed blurred together. News channels played the verdict on repeat, dissecting every detail. Editorials praised her as the mother who toppled a giant. Hashtags carried her whisper across continents. Survivors sent letters, gratitude folded into trembling handwriting, but Elena felt none of it belonged to her. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see a crusader or a warrior. She saw a woman hollowed out by nights in hospital rooms, a woman whose sister had chosen betrayal, a woman who had carried rage until it nearly consumed her. Justice was heavy, and she was tired. Richard Halden's empire disintegrated in public view. His penthouse was auctioned, his accounts frozen, his name scraped from the walls of university buildings. Yet Elena knew that for all the punishment, the damage could never be undone. Lives were already buried, scars already carved. Mateo's lungs would never be whole again. The law had stripped him of his wealth, but it couldn't erase the years he'd stolen from others. That truth lingered like smoke. One evening, Elena sat at Mateo's bedside. The machines hummed softly, their steady rhythm a fragile kind of comfort. He stirred, blinking up at her. "Mama, is it over?" She brushed his hair back gently. "Yes, baby. It's over. Is he gone?" "Yes," Mateo thought for a moment. "Then why are you sad?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him that justice and joy weren't the same thing. That sometimes winning felt like surviving with scars too deep to name. That she wished she could give him back the childhood stolen from him. Instead, she kissed his forehead and whispered, "Because I love you, that's all." The city moved on quickly. New scandals, new trials, new stories. But in small, quiet ways, Elena's fight lived on. A foundation was created in Mateo's name to support families harmed by negligent pharmaceuticals. Other mothers, emboldened by her courage, spoke out against companies that had silenced them. Her whisper had become a chorus, and still, every morning she packed lunches, paid bills, argued with insurance companies, sat in waiting rooms. Justice hadn't erased the burden of survival. It never would, but it had given her something else. The knowledge that her voice could shatter empires. One night, weeks after the sentencing, Elena lay beside Mateo. He was weaker than before, but calmer, his small body finally resting without pain. The apartment was quiet. The city's noise muffled by distance, she hummed softly. The melody one her mother used to sing. Mateo's eyelids fluttered. "Mama?" he whispered. "Yes, baby?" "What are you singing?" She smiled faintly. "A lullaby. Something to keep the nightmares away." He nestled closer. Can you whisper it? Like you did before? Her chest ached at the memory. The first whisper. The warning that stopped a signature and started a war. Words that had cut through lies like a blade. Now her whisper was different. She leaned close, lips near his ear, and let the melody fall soft and low. Not a warning. Not a weapon, a promise. Mateo's breathing slowed, steady, his body sinking into sleep. Elena held him, eyes wet but steady, and whispered the song until the room felt lighter. The world would remember her as the woman who toppled Richard Halden, the waitress who whispered truth into a billionaire's ear. But Elena knew her story was simpler. She was a mother who refused to be silent, a mother who carried her son through fire and shadow and who whispered when she had no strength left to shout. And that whisper had echoed, not as a warning anymore, as survival, as truth, as love.